This lecture is on the Keynesian Revolution, and I'm looking at the years from 1936 to 1965. And actually, this lecture will be divided into two parts. So the first part will take us up into the 1950s. Now, first definitions: Keynesianism. The Keynesian economics basically is where you have government intervention and management of the economy. So government takes a bigger role in managing the economy, and the end goal is to have economic well-being of society. Often with Keynesianism, you will have higher taxation, and there will be comprehensive regulation and sometimes price controls. So in other words, just to kind of simplify it, you have a more of a big government approach to the economy. So that's what I'm going to take a look at in this lecture. And let me begin. When 50-year-old economist Alvin H. Hansen arrived at Harvard University from the University of Minnesota in 1937, it was the beginning of a new era of economic thinking. An excellent representative of Keynesianism, he made good use of his subsequent decades at Harvard, sharing his passion for Keynesian ideas to improve the lot of humanity. He taught hundreds of economics students, including future Nobel Prize winner Paul Samuelson, the author of an economics college textbook loaded with Keynesian ideas that sold millions of copies. Following the teachings of Hansen and Samuelson, young economists recommend planned deficit spending and public debt as the best way to invigorate the American economy to get it out of recessions and depressions. Consequently, these economists received a warm welcome from many Washington politicians. In politics, the main beneficiary of the rise of Keynesianism was the Democratic Party. From the years 1860 to the year 1932, the Democrats held the presidency for 16 years, far short of the 56 years for Republicans for the same time period. It's different, though, in more recent times. From 1933 to 1969, the Democrats held the presidency for 28 years compared to 8 years for Republicans. Before the Great Depression, government spending at the federal, state, and local levels rarely exceeded 12% of the national income. However, by the 1970s, government spending rose to more than 40% of the national income. As Milton Friedman saw it, The Economist, there was a major change in both the public's perception of the role of government and the actual role assigned to government. These numbers were evidence of the shift from, quote, belief in individual responsibility, laissez-faire, and a decentralized and limited government to belief in social responsibility and a centralized and powerful government, end of quote. Whether they agreed with Friedman's choice of words, Keynesians viewed this development as positive for America. Having the electorate on their side made it all the easier for politicians to tax and spend. The early history of Keynesianism is about fascinating personalities. Born on the United Kingdom's Isle of Wight, A.C. Pigot was a bright scholar who became known as the father of modern welfare economics, mainly for his work on the trade-off between economic growth and equity for workers. The redistribution of money to the poor via progressive taxation, made sense to him, providing the economic well-being of the nation stayed strong. In the years 1908 to 1943, Pigou was chair of political economy at the University of Cambridge, a position previously held by Alfred Marshall, one of the most influential economists in history who, quote, helped make economics a field of study in its own right, end of quote. Pigou taught his students that understanding economics was one way to, quote, see through the bogus economic arguments of the politicians. Known for his frugality, vanity, and idiosyncratic character, he cut a distinctive figure walking through the Cambridge campus, poorly dressed, with his head down, seemingly unaware of the centuries-old university buildings he passed. In the 1950s, Pigou continued to wear a suit he had purchased before World War I. Polite social etiquette was for others. While in retirement, he showed no enthusiasm to welcome a visit by economist Milton Friedman, who viewed the eccentric Pigou as a, quote, great economist. As impressive as his Cambridge academic position was, Pigou worked at the same time as John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was another University of Cambridge graduate in economics and a Pigou rival who gained worldwide fame as the most influential economist of the 20th century. On Keynes' celebrated work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936, in 1951, Pigou wrote, quote, we frequently read of the Keynesian revolution. Indeed, Keynesianism, or perhaps I should rather say Keynesianism without the tears, for how many Keynesians, or for that matter, anti-Keynesianism, either have seriously studied his own book, end of quote. During the Jimmy Carter presidency, economist Edward Meadows of the University of South Carolina declared, quote, that not one Keynesian economist in 100 has ever read the General Theory. In Pigou's day, Keynes' inconsistent use of terms caused his book to be barely intelligible, even for professional economists. Few took the time to plow through Keynes' contorted and obscure writing, including run-on sentences loaded with semicolons. Nonetheless, Pigou spoke as one who had professional friction with Keynes. They were two scholars, both homosexuals, who tore apart each other's academic work. An early opponent of Keynesianism, Pigou had reprimanded Keynes for his arrogant statements in the General Theory. As it turned out, it did not matter that people did not read Keynes. The basic ideas from his work were enough for those advocating government interventions to smooth jarring boom-bust business cycles. Well, Keynes was born in England to a distinguished family. His father, a professor at the University of Cambridge, and his mother, the mayor of Cambridge. He attended the best schools, completing his education at the University of Cambridge, where he was part of a group that embraced bohemian ideas. Historians describe him as a promiscuous man who fit well into the Bloomsbury group that rejected Victorian convention. Years later, he admitted the group's dismissal of traditional morals and wisdom, as he wrote in his memoirs, quote, we were, that is to say, in the strict sense of the term, immoralists. Keynes was, historian Margaret Macmillan writes, a very clever, rather ugly young man. He was both charming and intimidating. Free market scholar Friedrich Hayek, who later won a Nobel Prize in economics, crossed swords with Keynes on many occasions, but he recognized his good fortune to experience the magnetism, quote, of the brilliant conversationalist with his wide range of interests and his bewitching voice. Hayek was one of the few who did not allow Keynes to browbeat him, thus earning his respect. After graduating from Cambridge, the gifted Keynes scored second place on the British Civil Service exam that led to a 2-year civil service position in India. Following his return, he taught economics at Cambridge. During World War I, he worked at the British Treasury, a job that caused him emotional pain. In a December 1917 letter to Duncan Grant, one of his lovers, Keynes admitted, quote, "I work for a government I despise for ends I think criminal." His criticism of the British government gained broader attention with the publication of The Economic Consequences of Peace, which argued that the Versailles Peace Treaty was too harsh on Germany. This was one of several books that brought him international fame. There was praise and there was denunciation. Historian Paul Johnson claims it was, quote, "one of the most destructive books of the century," for contributing to the future war Keynes himself was so anxious to avert. To no one's surprise, his main message won over many Germans. The verdict of the press was that the pro-German, quote, Keynes should be awarded Germany's highest award, the Iron Cross. By June 1920, sales of The Economic Consequences of Peace were at more than 100,000 copies worldwide, having been translated into many languages, including German. Certainly, Keynes spared no feelings with his attacks on the Versailles treaties, on the Versailles politicians he disliked. For example, in his memoirs, he penned a characteristically cruel sketch of France's Minister of Finance. Louis Lucien Clotz was, quote, "a short, plump, heavy-mustached Jew, well-groomed, well-kept, but with an unsteady, roving eye, and his shoulders a little bent in an instinctive deprecation." Keynes claimed that the minister attempted to slow shipments to starving Germans. Next was Keynes' A Tract on Monetary Reform. This was published in 1923. The book argued that central bank monetary management was the best way forward for domestic microeconomic prosperity. In the early 1920s, the disastrous effects of inflation were obvious in places, for example, Germany, where inflationary taxation was at a preposterous and suicide point. By the summer of 1923, a German needed to have 1,000,000 marks to exchange for $1. German children played with worthless banknotes as though they were wooden blocks. 7 years later, a treatise on money was Keynes's analysis of the savings-investment relationship as the main reason for cyclical movements in national economies. He claimed that both savings decisions by people and investment decisions by businesses needed to be equalized by the central bank either by lowering or raising interest rates. Intervention by money experts in the economy was the answer, so said Keynes. These books and other writings were impressive, but none matched the importance of Keynes's general theory, which sought to explain the forces behind production, employment, and cyclical movements such as the 1929 to 1933 worldwide depression. This marked the arrival of a new branch of economics called microeconomics, pointing to the misleading and disastrous consequences of classical theory, that is, laissez-faire policy, that had guided microeconomic thinking since the days of Adam Smith. The general theory opposed the two arguments that said full employment was the normal state of the economy and that high unemployment would eventually correct itself. Because the economy lacked the capacity for self-correction, Keynes argued that it was best to entrust intellectual elites with the task of properly managing the economy. Years later, Friedrich Hayek lamented his decision not to attack the general theory in 1936. One reason he held back from his analysis is that he believed Keynes might change his mind. Keynes had done so with his A Treatise on Money after Hayek put a great deal of work into 2 long articles on it. He recognized Keynes' supreme mental powers, but he viewed him as, quote, more an artist and politician than a scholar or student. Hayek, who considered Keynes a friend, explained, quote, if one considers how small a share of his time and energy he gave to economics, his influence on economics and the fact that he will be remembered chiefly as an economist are both miraculous and tragic. Keynes rejected the principle of government neutrality in the face of economic cycles, and he believed economic theory was a means to improve the lives of others. Yet the general theory did not push for specific government policy. It was subsequent Keynes promoters, keen for government to take on a greater role in the economy, who used its theoretical foundation for economic action. It was intellectually respectable to argue for government intervention in the economy. Economies could escape recession and depression if government spending was high. If private investment spending faltered, it was the task of the government to borrow money, engage in public investment spending, and run a budget deficit if necessary. The way Keynes envisioned it, once the economy was strong, government was to stop borrowing money, decrease public investment, and repay past loans. Would future politicians see it that way, however? As Americans struggled through the Great Depression of the 1930s, politicians felt the pressure to do something to alleviate the high unemployment and other disturbing economic realities. In his short visit to America in 1931, Keynes received a warm welcome from academics and politicians seeking new ideas. 2 years later, Keynes sent President Franklin D. Roosevelt a copy of his pamphlet, The Means to Prosperity. He also addressed the president in an open letter published late in December 1933 in the New York Times. The first sentence revealed much. You have made yourself the trustee for those in every country who seek to mend the evils of our condition by a reasoned experiment within the framework of the existing social system. For Keynes, the alternate to Roosevelt's social reform was for orthodoxy and revolution to fight it out. Even though he was critical of some of Roosevelt's policies, he sought to reassure the president, quote, "You remain for me the ruler whose general outlook and attitude to the tasks of government are the most sympathetic in the world. You are the only one who sees the necessity of a profound change of methods and is attempting it without intolerance, tyranny, or destruction." According to Keynes, by making adaptations and enlargements to the New Deal, Roosevelt could put America on the road to economic recovery with full employment and give, quote, "comfort to men's mind through restoration of their faith in the wisdom and the power of government." In the 10 months prior to Keynes' letter, Roosevelt had established far-ranging policies that brought about a level of government intervention never witnessed in American economic history. Indeed, decades later, Keynesian economist John Kenneth Galbraith argued that the business and financial sector welcomed Roosevelt as, quote, "an angel of rescue." Roosevelt's wife Eleanor viewed Inauguration Day in early March 1933 as, quote, "a very, very solemn and a little terrifying." Pledging direct, vigorous action in his oath of office, President Roosevelt pointed to the incompetence of business leaders. He reassured the American people that the only thing they had to fear is fear itself, declaring his faith thus, quote, "this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper." In his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt ushered in important legislation, including the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the National Industrial Recovery Act. When Roosevelt's assistant Raymond Moley warned him in 1933 that he was, quote, "taking an enormous step away from the philosophy of equalitarianism and laissez-faire," the president replied, quote, "if that philosophy hadn't proved to be bankrupt, Herbert Hoover would be sitting here right now." Launched with much fanfare, Roosevelt's boldest action was the creation of the National Recovery Administration. This was led by General Hugh Johnson. Displays of the NRA Blue Eagle insignia were everywhere, at workplaces, in stores, and on billboards. The promotional parade on New York's Fifth Avenue was impressive, but the NRA's attempt to set up a corporatist combine to plan output and prices had a short life. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. Director Johnson's journey was, quote, "from a reformist hellcat to a sobbing alcoholic." Before Roosevelt's New Deal, it was common to see federal budgets with peacetime surpluses. A shift took place, symbolized by Roosevelt's redefinition of freedom in the sense that government could guarantee economic security and prosperity. it became passé to define political freedom as freedom from the state. For conservatives, this reversal of thinking meant that the government was man's tender-hearted protector and provider, rather than a potential enemy of freedom. The government had both the moral obligation and the competence to run the macro economy and guarantee its citizens' economic security. In 1938, newspaper columnist Walter Lippmann wrote, quote, "The predominant teachings of this age are that there are no limits to man's capacity to govern others, and that, therefore, no limitations ought to be imposed on government." After the New Deal, federal budgets ran in the red nearly every year. Other numbers cast doubt on the belief that government intervention solved the economic miseries of the Great Depression. The New Deal was more a political success than an economic success. Conservative scholars maintain that Roosevelt's New Deal, built on the government intervention of President Herbert Hoover in the years 1929 to 1933, prolonged the years of high unemployment and a weak economy. With Roosevelt in the White House, unemployment rate remained above 14% for the rest of the decade. If the New Deal was the answer, how does one explain the 1937 to 1938 recession and unemployment rising to 17.4%, which was the level in 1931? Yet perceptions and a likable president mattered more than dry statistics. Roosevelt gave Americans hope when many of them faced heartbreaking daily hardships. Most of Roosevelt's policies remained popular, and he easily won the elections in 1936 and 1940. The sending of millions of soldiers into battle in World War II and massive war production ended unemployment, not Roosevelt's interventionist policies. Nonetheless, Americans stayed true to their war president. At age 62 and in poor health, he won again in 1944. The government's extensive role in the war convinced many Americans that centralized government was efficient. American soil was fertile for a Keynesian revolution in subsequent decades. In the immediate years after World War II, it became gospel that government planners had directed the U.S. economy to successfully ensure industrial superiority and Allied victory. Winning the day for Keynesianism were economists such as Alvin H. Hansen, the South Dakota farm boy known for his geniality, energy, and ability to translate difficult economic ideas into layman's terms. He became the point man for the triumph of Keynesianism in college and government circles. In Harvard classrooms, in testimonies before Washington politicians, and in public statements reaching general audiences, he earned the praise of becoming a great teacher, not only of students of economics, but of a whole generation of thinking laymen. Near the end of his life, Hansen received the following tribute from Milton Friedman, quote, "As you know, I have often disagreed with you on substance, but I have always admired your shining intellectual integrity, your concern solely with the truth, and your extraordinary capacity for clarity and forthrightness in exposition." Hansen's popularization of Keynesian ideas made it difficult for those who wanted to slow the growth and spending of government. Even Friedman had embraced much of Keynesian thinking during World War II when he worked for the government. Years later, he admitted, quote, "I had completely forgotten how thoroughly Keynesian I then was. I was apparently cured, or some would say corrupted, shortly after the end of the war." Early opponents to Keynesianism were few. One dissenting voice was Friedrich Hayek, who witnessed how hyperinflation had destroyed the Austrian and German economies after World War I. He was a student at the University of Vienna when it barely functioned because of shortage of coal, light, and food. He feared that Keynesian economics and inflation went hand in hand. After his years challenging Keynes's work of the 1930s, he became a favorite of conservative Americans. Most of his reputation was the result of his opposition to government planning, especially by socialist politicians. Visits to the United States and an eventual teaching post at the University of Chicago brought his work to the attention of Americans concerned about government's increasing intervention in the business world. Rejected for publication in America by 3 publishers before the book's acceptance by the University of Chicago Press, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, warned of the dangers of state control of the economy. Although the University expected modest sales at best, within a month, a second and third printing were necessary to meet the demand. When the Reader's Digest offered a 20-page condensed version in April of 1945, sales climbed higher and Hayek attracted large crowds at speaking engagements on his American book tour. It is a controversial book. Quote, "I was at first a bit puzzled and even alarmed when I found that a book written in no party spirit and not meant to support any popular philosophy should have been so exclusively welcomed by one party and so thoroughly execrated by the other." The criticism of progressives was unmistakable, with political scientist Herbert Feiner claiming Hayek's book constituted, quote, "the most sinister offensive against democracy to truly emerge from a democratic country for many decades." Overall, Hayek was not much of a threat to those favoring economic planning. Enrolled in the School of Commerce, Accounts, and Finance at the New York University, Alan Greenspan, future chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, witnessed how economic students were on a mission to echo the wisdom of Keynes. Many saw Keynesianism as offering a more superior path than either socialism or the classical economics of the free marketers. Memories of the Great Depression lingered. Future New York University economics professor Robert Cavish, one of Greenspan's classmates, explained years later of the rarity to find anyone who was not strongly influenced by the Democratic Party and John Maynard Keynes and his idea about the very strong role that government could and should play in dominating economic affairs. Greenspan acknowledged the magnitude of Keynesianism, but he was the rare young American economist who was not an ardent Keynesian. One of his closest intellectual friends years later was Ayn Rand, the Russian immigrant who wrote influential novels championing laissez-faire capitalism. If conservatives found her secular rationalist praise for capitalism problematic, her work became a favorite among libertarians not troubled with her attacks on Christianity. It was not ideology, however, behind Greenspan's modest attention to Keynesianism. His focus was on the technical challenges of economic thinking rather than policy. In those early days, he was more passionate about classical music and playing the clarinet in an orchestra, letting others take on the mission to improve society by way of macroeconomic policy. Unpredictably, it was a 24-year-old with a recent BA degree in English literature who stood out for publicly challenging Keynesian and socialist theorizing. William F. Buckley Jr. became an influential American public intellectual of the 20th century. A devout Catholic, he wrote God and Man at Yale. This book was published in 1951. And he wrote and had it published soon after graduating from Yale University. His book rocked academia and Yale administrators with the message for alumni to stop financially supporting the university until it ceased to undermine Christianity and free market ideas. Buckley's challenge was heresy to the old-line Yale families who defended the university's elite liberalism. The findings in God and Man at Yale indicated that Yale University's economic faculty was roughly 80% in favor of some type of economic collectivism. He acknowledged that most economic professors at Yale did not teach, quote, the overthrow of capitalism violently or otherwise. However, they did follow another approach envisioned by Karl Marx. That is, a slow increase of state power through extended social services, taxation, and regulation to a point where a small transition could be effected from an individualist to a collectivist society. If there was any confusion on where Buckley stood concerning Keynesianism, he wrote of the, quote, slavish disciples of the late Lord Keynes, who do not know so much as acknowledge the existence of economists who violently dispute Keynes' conclusions. Yale's economics students read the introductory work of Keynesian Paul A. Simonson, who wrote, quote, cradle to grave security has great popularity. If the private economy cannot supply it naturally, people will insist upon getting it artificially from governments. With a strong background in mathematics, Samuelson received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology offered him a teaching position, and he became full professor at age 32. His authorship of a best-selling introductory economics textbook earned him fame and a small fortune. Beyond his scholarship on Keynesian macroeconomics, consumer choice, and international trade, Samuelson promoted expansionary macroeconomic policies in Washington, D.C. Describing his life philosophy, he wrote, quote, "Mine is a simple ideology that favors the underdog and, other things equal, abhors inequality." Other required reading at Yale promoted central macroeconomic management without any tribute to the free enterprise system that conservatives argued raised America's standard of living to #1 in the world. One textbook taught that most Americans insist on wealth redistribution by heavy taxation on higher income groups. Taxation during World War II was as high as 94%, which Ronald Reagan experienced firsthand, clearing only 6 cents for every dollar he earned. Even when the war ended, it remained acceptable to have high taxation during peacetime. Buckley noted that in Theodore Morgan's Income and Employment, college students learned that going into business for oneself is not a basic freedom. There was little praise for private businesses creating employment. More sensible was government exercising its power to ensure full employment. These economists looked to the teachings of Keynes for their blueprint of government-planned full employment. With war spending over, many Americans worried that their jobs would be scarce. In 1946, Congress passed the Employment Act that promoted conditions under which there would be afforded useful employment for those able, willing, and seeking to work. Fortunately, post-war prosperity absorbed most war workers and veterans seeking employment. There was much faith in Keynesianism, and some, such as Samuelson, rejected arguments that it would cause a high national debt. The belief that internal debt would be passed on to future generations was, quote, unmistakably false. The overall argument was that there was no limit to government spending. William Buckley warned of a troubling claim by Keynesianism. Quote, all the society's ills, the economic, the social, the ethical, can be ameliorated by bigger and bigger government. Too many of these economists, quote, did not consider private property or private enterprise essential to democracy or even to freedom. For Buckley, the ideological position of Wilford E. Binkley, who wrote A Grammar of American Politics, the National Government, was instructive. Quote, it is of importance whether a Coolidge or a Roosevelt occupies the White House. One man may be obsessed with an obstinate faith in an outmoded economic or social ideology, while another is a crusader for the good life by increasing the social services of the government. For Buckley, what Binkley had wrote was clearly where the nation was heading, at least as far as the Democratic Party and most economists. There was a strong optimism for the notion of government spending the good life for all citizens. Besides, who could oppose this goal? No one wanted people to be without the necessities of life. Buckley's God and Man at Yale created a stir. Its dire warnings pointed to how entrenched the policies of government intervention had become. although America escaped the state ownership policies of post-World War II Britain and France. Nonetheless, Americans paid little attention. Few saw the word liberal in a negative light. Liberal was forward-looking. As late as 1960, Charles Frankel in the New York Times Magazine wrote that Herbert Hoover, Dwight Eisenhower, and Richard Nixon, quote, had kind words to say about liberalism and would bridle if it were called anti-liberal. And would bridle if he were called anti-liberal. With the war-torn economies of Europe and Japan many years from recovery, it was a golden age for American production and employment. Without much international industrial competition, America experienced impressive post-war prosperity and the necessary revenue. This is coming into the early 1950s. Liberal politicians believed for increased government spending. Critics such as Buckley remained mostly on the periphery. So I'm going to conclude there, and I will return to this for part 2. Thank you.